Okay, so I'm going to be talking about parliamentary elections that just took place last weekend. In a way, we can say that if we analyze the events of the past year, in some sense, these parliamentary elections, in a way, like an endpoint for the Maidan political development. That was one of the demands of the protesters to have Rada elections, among other things. And these are the pre-term elections that were scheduled by the president. He used the breakdown of the coalition at his constitutional right to call for early elections 30 days after, and that's what we had, right? So is this the clicker, right? Right. So even before the results were known, there was already interesting event, or feature of these elections we could identify is in particular the lower turnout than I think in any previous election, certainly much lower than in the 2012 parliamentary election, right? So here we can see on these two maps, right, in some sense there is a continuing pattern of the central and western regions voting somewhat higher numbers, but there is very low turnout in many of the eastern and southern regions, something definitely worth for all of us discussing, and I'm going to come back to it in a couple of minutes. And of course, there were no elections held in the Russian-occupied Crimea, and in parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast that are controlled by the separatist insurgents, right? So all in all, we're talking about 12 electoral districts in Crimea and 15 out of the 32 electoral districts in the Donbass region where no elections were held. So I'm going to, the 10 minutes that I have, or now probably more like 9, to talk about some of the results and especially some of the maybe surprising outcomes, and also the implications. And of course, there are many, but I'm going to pick a couple, and then we can add to it in the discussion. So these are the official results as of this morning, with 99.74% of the vote counted. Elections were held under the mixed system, with half of the parliament elected in the party list vote and half in the single-member district. So this is the party list vote result. And a couple of things here to note. First of all, that we see that the president's party, the Petro Poroshenko bloc, did not win, did not come first, as was widely anticipated. And that's perhaps, ties with what Tim was saying, that if many voters voted for the president in May, to avoid second round, they didn't really have much incentive to vote for his party, we would think so, right, this time around. So we see the prime minister's party narrowly coming ahead of the president. So again, this is something, depending sort of where you stand, perhaps, how you would assess this development. But one thing that I would mention, which I think is a positive, is that it means that it would be much harder for the president to usurp power, right? So this control of the legislature by the executive, which has been a problem in Ukraine, from Kuchma through Yanukovych for sure. I think now, at least on that front, I mean, it created arguably other problems that maybe we'll get to talk about, but I think that's important to keep in mind. Another surprise of these elections is the third place winner, this party of Samopomich, or how does it translate in English? Self-help, right? Self-reliance, perhaps, right? So that's the party associated and sort of the mayor of Lviv, the West Ukrainian city, and it included many new faces on its list, people associated with the anti-corruption reform measures, the reincarnation package of reforms. Again, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. So I think what we see here, it's a new force in the parliament. It would be interesting to see what they actually do, but I think it shows that there is a need sort of in the society, that there is, a demand, I should rather say, for this kind of new faces and for reforms, right? Again, it may fall, it's really hard to say at this point, impossible to say if Samopomich would sort of fulfill the expectations that many people arguably had voting for it, but at least it shows that there is this sort of demand both for new faces and for kind of, reformist forces. And it's interesting to note it came second in Kiev city, although, right, we can say in some sense, it was mayor of Lviv being its head. It's not kind of from Kiev. Right, the third, I think, interesting result, again, we can see it here, the parties who didn't make it in the parliament, and one of it is the Communist Party. So that's really kind of a watershed moment in Ukrainian political history. We can say that it's for the first time since 91, or, if we count, obviously, the communist period when Communist Party was the only party in the parliament. But certainly, since 91, that the communists did not make it. Right, and, given, again, the electorate tended to be older anyway. I mean, if I were to make some bet, I would say that they probably will not make it, in the subsequent elections as well. So it's it could be really the end of the era for Ukrainian Communist Party as a parliamentary force, which by itself is definitely something worth discussing in greater detail. Now, finally, also this slide shows that we see the failure of the Svoboda party, the far-right party Svoboda, that made sort of a surge in the parliamentary scene in 2012 elections when it made it into the parliament for the first time. This time it failed to clear the 5% threshold. It still got some deputies elected in the single-member district, but it didn't make it on the party list, and nor did the right sector, which got, what was it, like 1 point, I can't see here, well, whatever it got, right? Not 1.8, right? One expert of the Ukrainian far right calculated. He went through the Anton Shekhovtsov. He posted on Facebook a couple of days ago his count of how many far right members the Ukrainian parliament will now have, including independents and people who ran on the other party list. And he came up with a total of 13 people, or 3% of the parliament. Again, we'll have the session on the far right tomorrow, but it's interesting also to think about sort of what are the reasons for this happening. Why some, far-right candidates were, I think microphone's not working. I have 2 microphones. Okay, this one works. All right. So why is it that the Svoboda didn't make it as a party, and at the same time some far-right people got elected in the single-member districts, including quite sort of puzzling development. I don't think Putin can quite wrap his head around it, probably either, that the leader of the far-right right sector party got elected in a single-member district in the Dnipropetrovsk region, right, which according to Putin belongs to Novorossiya. So, but we'll let Putin puzzle over that. Okay, so. A little bit on the implications. So this is the count. Again, this is not the final count, but the several people who analyze electoral data put together a chart that I use the numbers. That if you count deputies who were elected on the party list from these 5 parties that made it into the parliament, or 6 parties, and then people who ran in the single-member district on the party ID. And very importantly, how the independents who got elected, who basically ran as independent candidates, and that's a substantial number of those, I think close to 100, right? If you actually break them down into who these people were and which party, group they're more likely to join. This is roughly what the breakdown becomes. I read this morning that in fact it's not 14 but 18 independents who asked to join the Poroshenko bloc caucus in the parliament. So in a way, this sort of category of pro-governmental / pro-Western parties is going to be even larger, right? And this is really an important and I think result of the Ukrainian elections that we are going to be looking at its consequences for the duration of this parliament. That for the first time again in the post-Soviet history in Ukraine, that there isn't this almost evenly divided parliament between the parties and the deputies that could be sort of roughly categorized as kind of being pro-Russian and pro-Western, but we really have this constitutional majority of the parties, the post-Maidan parties, that at least declare its affiliation to sort of Western orientation, of Ukraine, and a much smaller a much smaller contingent of sort of, purportedly pro-Russian parties. So what does it mean? I mean, I think there are a couple of things I wanted to mention here. First of all, I think, again, somewhat ironically, the reason for this disbalance emerging, or at least one of the reasons, is exactly Putin's action vis-a-vis Ukraine that excluded from the voting roll about 4 million people who reliably in the past voted for pro-Russian parties. So the electorate in Crimea and the electorate in this 15 of the 32 districts in the Donbass. So altogether, it's about 4 million voters who voted in the previous elections in Ukraine who did not now. So in a way, sort of Putin, almost created the very reality he wanted to avoid so badly, for Ukraine kind of becoming more Western, more pro-Western, right? That's one thing. Right, another thing we know, I'm not going to say much about it now since we're out of time, but it would be interesting to see what it means for coalition formation, right? Sort of having this broader number of pro-government parties, would we have how the divisions between the members of the pro-government coalition, would that be as destabilizing as it was in Ukraine during Yushchenko tenure? Arguably less so, because there is sort of more of a cushion for formation of the coalition, so that's another thing. If we look at how different parties did in different parts of Ukraine. A couple of things I mentioned here, and then we can talk more about it in Q&A. The situation in the eastern regions, right, where basically the remains of the Party of Region that run as the opposition bloc clearly won in Kharkiv, Luhansk, and Donetsk. But the picture is much more mixed in other southern and eastern regions. So I don't think we can really talk about sort of southeast as the bloc, as we have, many of us, or certainly, many experts and analysts analyzed Ukraine sort of divided in these two camps. What we now see, there is really a variation within the southeast, right? And in places such as like Odessa, for example, Mykolaiv and Kherson, the Poroshenko bloc did better than the opposition bloc. And then in places such as Odessa, Zaporizhia, and Dnipropetrovsk, it's more evenly divided. And really, it's the Kharkiv, Luhansk, and Donetsk where the opposition bloc, continues to do well, right? So again, so the question here, one of the questions would be like, are voters of the southeast, given the lower turnout there, do they feel disenfranchised? Is there perhaps a need for a new party, right, that would address the interests of these voters, right, but wouldn't be associated with the former Yanukovych regime? And I would say there is a need for such a party, and we might see whether or not it will be forming, right? And finally, right, this is somebody did this calculation, if not just looking at the front runners, but adding up the vote of all the parties that could be called sort of, roughly pro-Russian and roughly pro-Western, and seeing how these parties did in total in the different regions of Ukraine. And I think what we clearly see here, this sort of pro-Western, attitudes, we can say, moving further east, right? And again, we can discuss reasons for it. Like clearly, I mean, first of all, we shouldn't overestimate it. There are still plenty of people in the east who feel, alienated and do not support these pro-government parties and did not support the Maidan. But at the same time, I mean, we do see, I mean, according to this, the shift, in preferences, at least in some parts of the, what used to be called the southeast. And that's maybe something we can discuss more as we have the conversation after the panel.